Holding the line: how civilizations survive ideological collapse in the age of radicalization. When I speak about what is happening right now in the United States and across the Western democratic world, I want to be deliberate, precise, and intellectually honest, because careless language is one of the accelerants of civilizational decline. What we are witnessing is not simply a wave of protest, nor is it merely the resurfacing of radical ideologies that never truly disappeared. What we are seeing is something deeper and far more dangerous: a widespread erosion of institutional trust paired with a growing belief, especially among younger generations, that the democratic system itself is incapable of delivering fairness, dignity, and opportunity. Civilizations do not collapse because people argue. They collapse when people no longer believe those arguments can be resolved within the system. This is the moment politics stops being a mechanism for negotiation and becomes a moral battlefield. Once politics is framed as a war between absolute good and absolute evil, compromise is no longer viewed as prudence. It's viewed as betrayal, and history is unforgiving when societies reach that stage. I want to make something very clear from the start. Protest is not the enemy of democracy. Dissent is not a threat to civilization. In fact, both are essential to it. What threatens a civilization is the belief that the system itself is irredeemable, that reform is impossible, and destruction is the only moral option left. That belief is the soil in which revolutionary ideologies grow, regardless of whether they come dressed in Marxist language, utopian idealism, or modern activist rhetoric. History shows us this pattern with remarkable consistency. Revolutionary movements rarely begin with violence. They begin with language. They begin by redefining institutions not as flawed, but as illegitimate. They divide the world into oppressors and oppressed, virtue and evil, victims and villains. Complexity disappears and moral certainty takes its place, and once that framing takes hold, any action becomes justifiable because the system itself is portrayed as inherently violent. This is psychologically powerful. Human beings are not built to endure long-term uncertainty, economic insecurity, or moral confusion. When institutions fail to explain themselves, when leaders rely on slogans instead of substance, when systems feel distant and unresponsive, people will look elsewhere for meaning. Ideology becomes a substitute for trust. It offers certainty where institutions offer process. It offers identity where systems offer rules. But this is where the danger deepens. The real threat to democratic societies is not radical ideas themselves. Ideas can be debated, tested, disproven, and absorbed. The true threat is the collapse, legitimacy in the institutions that peacefully manage conflict. Courts, elections, schools, civil service, neutral law enforcement. These are not abstract concepts. They are invisible frameworks that allows millions of strangers to coexist within coercion. Once people stop believing these institutions are fair, competent, or neutral, the rules stop working. Contracts stop being trusted, laws stop being respected, and elections stop being accepted. And then rules lose legitimacy. Power fills a vacuum, not wisdom, and not justice. Power. This is how things get dark, not all at once, but quietly and incrementally. Revolutionary ideologies rarely destroy societies in dramatic moments. They corrode them slowly. Language hardens and dissent becomes hearsay, institutions become enemies, and eventually enforcement becomes necessary, not to protect the freedom, but to enforce the ideological purity. History teaches us this lesson relentlessly. Movements that begin by denouncing hierarchy almost always replaces it with something far worse: centralized power with no accountability and no moral restraint. We have seen this repeatedly in revolutionary Russia, The destruction of institutions in the name of equality produced a state that controlled food, labor, speech, and life itself. In Maoist China, ideological purity dismantled education and expertise, setting the nation back decades. In Cambodia, utopian thinking led to genocide. In Venezuela, revolutionary rhetoric hollowed out institutions until corruption, scarcity, and repression became normalized. The outcomes were not accidents, they were the predictable result of institutional collapse. And here's the uncomfortable truth many refuse to confront. When institutions fail, the people who suffer most are never the ideological elites. They are ordinary citizens, working families, small business owners, immigrants, minorities, the elderly, the poor, those without political protection or economic mobility. The wealthy adapt, the radicals consolidate, and the consolidate power, and everyone else pays the price. A nation does not descend into chaos because its people are inferior or uncivilized. That framing is false and dangerous. Nations collapse because the trust evaporates. And once people stop trusting courts, currency, law enforcement, and governance itself, society stops functioning and the markets freeze. Crime rises and capital flees, and talent leaves, and the social fabric tears. At that point, the ideology becomes almost irrelevant. Disorder takes over. So the real question before us is not how to eliminate radical ideas. They will always exist. The question is whether democratic institutions can retain enough legitimacy to channel conflict without breaking. And the answer is not repression. Repression does not defeat radicalism, it fuels it. Every censored voice becomes a martyr. Every banned idea gains mystique. Every act of institutional overreach erodes the moral authority of the system it claims to protect. History shows us that suppression accelerates radicalization. It does not contain it. The real defense of civilization is competence, clarity, and trust. Civic education must be restored, not as indoctrination, but as serious intellectual grounding. People must understand why constitutional systems are intentionally slow, why checks and balances exist, and why insufficiency is often the price of freedom. A population that understands this and its system is far harder to radicalize. Economic reality must be addressed honestly. Ideology feeds on despair when people feel locked out of housing, buried in debt, and disconnected from opportunity. Radical narratives gain power not because they are true, but because they speak to lived experience. Economic dignity is not just policy, it is civilizational defense. Free speech must be protected aggressively. Democracies that abandon free expression abandon legitimacy. Open debate strips bad ideas of their moral glamour and forces them to confront reality. Underground movements thrive on persecution over societies that deprive them of oxygen. Institutional neutrality must be defended at all costs. Courts must be courts, schools must educate, and law enforcement must enforce laws, not ideology. The military must serve the Constitution, not movements. Once institutions become weapons, trust collapses, and once collapses, nothing holds. We must also confront foreign influence without paranoia. Authoritarian regimes understand that they do not need to defeat democracies militarily, they only need to fracture trust. Disinformation, polarization, and cynicism. This is modern warfare. The defense is transparency, resilience, and institutional credibility, not fear-driven crackdowns. And most importantly, democratic societies must reclaim narrative authority. If leaders do not explain complexity, acknowledge failure, and articulate why democracy, despite its flaws, is worth preserving, Others will fill the silence. Revolutionary ideologies thrive in voids. People need leaders who explain trade-offs, limits, and responsibilities, not leaders who promise salvation through destruction. Civilization survives not because they are perfect, but because people believe they are worth improving rather than burning down. That belief is fragile. It must be earned again and again. Holding the line does not mean resisting change. It means insisting that change occur within law, restraint, and shared reality. It means recognizing that once trust collapses, rebuilding it can take generations. And it means understanding that the true enemy of democracy is not protest, it's nihilism. Democracy is not self-sustaining. It requires competence, humility, patience, and legitimacy. When people believe the systems can still work for them, extremism fades. When they believe it cannot, extremism grows no matter what language it speaks. You do not defeat destructive ideologies by crushing them. You defeat them by making them unnecessary. This is how civilization endures. Thank you for listening.